Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this discussion, to our webinar, an IIP talk with Angela Kane, the Vice President of the International Institute for Peace. And the discussion today is titled Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution, Experiences from the Field. My name is MARYLIA. I'm a researcher at the IIP, and I will be moderating this session. And you will, of course, also have space for your questions, so please don't be shy. Ask them in the Q&A session. We will be happy to take them all. This discussion is actually dedicated to the 8th of March, the International Women's Day that's taking place tomorrow. And therefore, we will, of course, cover the very relevant topic for conflict resolution and diplomacy, which is the role of women in this field. And Angela Kane has a lot of experience from her almost 4 decades long career at the United Nations, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about them. But we will also speak not only about the role of women, but in general about progress and what can be done in conflict resolution, and what can the UN do, and what lessons learned can we have and draw from previous conflict situations. And I'm very much hoping that this will be, we will hear some relevant and very valuable inputs that can also help us to deal with the situation in Europe these days, and still look into a brighter future despite many terrible things that are happening. So maybe before we start with asking Angela, I would like to introduce her very shortly. Angela was born in Hamelin. It's a town in Lower Saxony in Germany, and she studied at the University of Munich, also in Germany, and later on she moved to the United States, where she continued her education at Bryn Mawr College, and then at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced Studies, International Studies. In 1977, she entered the United Nations, and since then she worked there for almost 4 decades in several posts, basically on every continent in the world. She had posts in Asia, in Thailand and Indonesia, then in Eritrea, as well as in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. She served, of course, at the New York Secretariat in various positions. And she was also active in organizing conferences on disarmament already back in the days when the USSR was still there. She traveled there a lot as well. And through these experiences, she gathered really a lot of various experiences from different types of engagement. So from civilian missions, peacekeeping missions, from UN Secretariat work, diplomatic negotiations, and conflict resolutions. And we will hear about them more today. But before we start with this very specific, in-depth discussion, I would like to ask Angela to provide us some context from those days when she just started her career at the United Nations. So if you could give us some idea how it looked back then, what was the situation for women entering this field of work?
Thank you very much, MARYLIA, and welcome to all of you who've joined for this, and happy International Women's Day. I'm not quite sure it's always a happy event, but in any case, it's an event that needs to be publicized, that needs to be talked about, that needs to be written about, because there's still a lot to be done for women. And I should also recall that it was first observed in 1914, and in Austria and in Germany, for example, the women only obtained the vote in 1918, so that's just over 100 years ago. And the UN Charter, we must remember that, was really the very, very first document that inscribed the equal rights of men and women as part of fundamental human rights. It had never been in any international treaty, in any international document before. And that was really the achievement of several Latin American women who took part in the drafting of the Charter and then were there at the Charter Conference. And that was a very, very important achievement. And the first conference, the first World Conference on Women, was held in Mexico in 1975. And that was the first year that the International Women's Day was observed on 8 March. And it was observed, I should say, it was not celebrated, because there was no reason to celebrate. at the United Nations. And as Maria did not say, she said over 40 years, but I joined the UN in 1977. And then you sort of say, you know, what was the situation for women then? The UN was primarily a place of white men in dark suits. And at that time, Secretary General Waldheim already posited that a ratio of 25% of women to 75% men in the professional staff could be achieved, might be achieved by 1980. Of course, it wasn't. It took a really much longer time until then. And my first supervisor was a middle-level woman. She was the editor of the UN yearbook, and I had gotten into the UN because I could write English well and I could actually edit English. And at the time, I didn't think that there was a point in wanting a career at the United Nations. But I was in New York. I didn't have a work visa. And I thought, well, you know, why not go and work for the United Nations? But on the other hand, when I look back, I must say that there were a few milestones to achieve for women. But the first woman who was ever appointed to head a political mission, a peacekeeping mission, was Margaret Anstey, and that was in 1992. And if you think about it, 30 years ago, the first woman, and by that point, of course, the UN had already been in existence for close to 40 years. So that was a long time. And I spent, at the time that she was appointed, I spent a lot of, it was in Angola, and I spent a lot of time in the Security Council at the time. And I will tell you that there were a lot of very demeaning remarks made about her, that, you know, she actually, there was comment on her dress, there was comment on her makeup, there was comment on her wearing high heels in the Security Council, not in the formal meetings, but in the consultation room where, you know, usually these things are discussed. And I found it then already outrageous when I heard this. But it was really, women were very sadly underrepresented at the senior levels, because in 1985, when I'd been there already for 7 years, only 23% of the professional posts were actually held by women, but only 7% had appointments that were at the D1 level. And if you know the UN, you have like P2 to P5, then you have D1, D2, that's a director level, already very senior, and then you have Assistant Secretary General and Undersecretary General. So 7% were like at the somewhat senior middle level, a little bit more senior than middle level posts. 7% of women were then. And that is really what I thought was really very, very sad. And so it was very rare that you had a woman who was even a D1 or a D2. So there were no role models. And that is something that I find very, very important, to have a role model to see. And in my entire career at the United Nations, I will tell you, I've never had a woman boss. I hired myself a lot of women because I think it's important to have them and for them to learn also and to see how a woman operates in a job. But I had never had a woman boss.
So maybe if you can reflect very quickly, if you can give maybe one or two, you know, achievements and that have been made since then, if you compare the situation back then to what it is right now, and then the maybe one or two persistent, you know, challenges or drawbacks that still exist and need to be tackled.
When you think about, you know, where are women, and I will give you just a little bit of an anecdote. I remember we had Kofi Annan at the time had wanted to have a deputy secretary general, and he got it through for the member states, and so he appointed Louise Frechette of Canada. She had been a minister for defense. She had been ambassador at the United Nations, and this was basically something that was so unprecedented. It was so unprecedented because she wore pants to the office, and she wore pantsuits to the office. And I would tell you that the UN was so conservative, and still is in many ways, but I never wore pants. Women in professional positions never wore pants to the office. But when she did, all of a sudden we did. So I kind of enlarged my wardrobe to actually wear pants. And I thought it was liberating. You know, this was in the 90s. I mean, it isn't even that long ago, but on the other hand, it was just something that was very important for us women to have a role model, to have a woman who was brave enough. And she also was brave enough. I had so many meetings with her because that was at the time in the late 90s when, you know, the wars in former Yugoslavia had broken out, and she was chairing a round table, and so she had all of these men undersecretary generals, and I was in the political department at that time, and I was a D2 level, which was already, you know, pretty high. But in any case, and she basically was very brusque with the men. She kind of brushed them off and sort of said, no, you know, I want this and I want that, and they were all kind of sitting there because they had never had that experience of being told by a woman what to do. And it was enlightening for a woman at my place, to basically sit there and then to witness this. It was really, really incredibly powerful. And that shows you, in essence, that if you have a woman who is visible, who is decisive, who has authority, and who sits in the corner office, you can really do an awful lot. And I've always argued in favor of that, because you have to basically have a number of women who are seen to be powerful, who are seen to have influence. But how do you get that influence? And I've been very fortunate, even though I've never had a woman boss, of having actually been appointed to positions where I was able to learn, particularly in the political field. And I have also argued that when you have you go out to the field and you have a special representative, or you have an Undersecretary General in headquarters, they always have special assistants, and they're usually at the P5 to D2 level, depending on the office. And I've always argued that these should be posts that should be reserved for people who are career officials at the UN. But what do they very often do? They are parachuted in from the outside, and they basically say, oh, I'm nationality X, and I want another person from nationality X next to me. So you don't really get that experience unless you get appointed to a position like that, and you can watch it. And the same is true in the peacekeeping missions. And if I look at that, you have right now, you have 12 peacekeeping missions. 10 of them are headed by men. 10. 2 of them are headed by women. So that is not a very high percentage, even though Secretary General Guterres was very conscious of the fact that there was a tremendous uptick in interest on having a woman elected Secretary General of the United Nations when he was elected, which was 6 years ago. And there was a tremendously strong campaign. And frankly, my heart was all in it. I thought that it would be time for a woman to be appointed Secretary General. And when he was appointed, he made it a prerequisite that he said, I am going to appoint a lot of senior women, which he did at headquarters. But that does not mean that it streams down. And unfortunately, and again, I must say that when you look at the women who were appointed, primarily they came from member states. So they were parachuted in, they came from, as we say, from across the street. I am not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, because they bring different experiences, but they don't know the house. They don't know how the UN operates. And they're still, if they come as a former ambassador, as a former minister, that means they come with a national picture and a national baggage, if you so want, which is natural. But they are not seen by others also as true international civil servants. Some make that change, but others do not. And I find that very regrettable, and particularly because they don't always choose people who work closely with them in their department.
Yeah, maybe to continue this discussion, I would also recall one of your interviews where you said that too many men, therefore most high officials, are more focused on the next promotion in their career path. And that was your argumentation that basically that's why there are fewer women, and you yourself basically also served in many positions, and it wasn't, as I understand, the main idea to get high on the ladder. But this is very interesting for me, because it actually correlates to some research data that I found, that women are more concerned about their first promotion, while men are looking towards the second and the third promotion more. So my question would be here, okay, we cannot maybe influence, the psychology of men and women if there are like some, fundamental differences to it. But can the system, and you already spoke about the United Nations itself, can it somehow create the structural conditions that would, encourage women to be, to strive for higher levels, or vice versa, for men to, go a little bit broader than just focusing on the career?
There is something that can be done, but it also is very much a temperamental issue, I believe. And something that could be done, and I give you an example, is, none of us is really born to speak freely, in front of crowds. People get very nervous. I think that women get more nervous than men. And I remember that I thought to myself at one point, well, I really must try to get a little bit of a training. Well, the UN does not really have much training at all. I mean, I had like 2 or 3 training courses in my entire career, so that isn't very much. But on the other hand, what is possible is you always have these groups, at least not during COVID times, but before and hopefully after. They come to the UN and then they want to be spoken to on various topics. I mean, that could be general UN, and you get them for an hour and then they go. Well, so I volunteered to the speakers bureau, as they called it. And once you've done that, and particularly when you have young students, like high school students who are fidgety and they're not really very interested in what you want to hear, you learn how to concentrate. And the other issue that you have to do is you have to prepare well. If you know what you're going to say, you're going to be a much better speaker. But on the other hand, what I have found is that men, yes, they will always look for the next promotion, and they will be very focused on that. And women are not willing to, very often, I'm generalizing now, but women are very often not willing to apply to positions unless they feel they are 100% qualified. And I think that's wrong, because if you are 100% qualified, you should be looking for another job. But on the other hand, if you have 60% of the qualifications, that's my standard, 60 to 70% of the qualifications, apply for it, and the rest you will learn. No one expects you to know all of the ins and outs of a job that you're going to have. And I have encouraged a number of young women who I thought had a lot of promise and sort of say, look, here's this job, and why don't you apply? And I remember there was one woman in particular who I liked a lot. I thought she had great potential, and I urged her to apply for it. And she said, oh, I'm very comfortable right now, and I really like to stay. Well, I will never go back to a person like that, because that wasn't enough of a reason, as far as I'm concerned, to actually sort of say, no, I really don't want the job. If you have other considerations, like there's a lot of travel involved with the job, you can't do it because of personal circumstances, that's a different issue. I understand that, and I think we must make allowances for that. But on the other hand, I think I was never interested in just like looking for the next promotion. I wanted to have an interesting job, and I wanted to have an interesting life. And I said to you that in the beginning, I didn't think it was going to be a career, but the longer I stayed, after a couple of years, it was so interesting. I mean, who would leave that? I just couldn't possibly do that, because it was just a wonderful experience. I was working with these really bright people. I had great colleagues. I had great assignments. But the other thing that I did, and I changed a lot at the same level, I moved laterally, meaning that I didn't look for the next promotion, but I looked for the next interesting job. And that gives you a portfolio that is a lot more rounded than it is in other, if you stay for longer. I think the longest job I had was actually as Undersecretary General for Management, which was not my life. It was not my choice. I was forced into it by the Secretary General. I wanted to also leave it much earlier. But on the other hand, that was 4 years. And the longest ones I usually had was usually it was about 3 years. So I had 15 different jobs in the United Nations, which was really great. But what also happens is, because there were no women, I had a number of jobs where I was really kind of the first, and meaning the first in the job. And that is like, for example, I was one of the first negotiators in the El Salvador peace process, and that was again fascinating. And I worked with only men. I had a team that was men. I was basically the job description at the time was that I had a boss who was negotiating with the government of El Salvador and the guerrillas, and he was mostly outside of the country in Mexico, because that was the safest to negotiate there. And he, approached me and he said, Angela, I need someone who, has a good political sense, but who has also ideas. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, in the negotiations, we come up with issues that are very hard to solve. We have to find solutions. And can you think of solutions? That was my job description. And I thought it was fascinating. So, you have to just be willing to do that. And I did. And I was responsible for, with a team of experts, to put together one chapter in the peace accords. And that was on the establishment of a national civil police. And again, here I come in as what is really important as a woman also, because when we were talking to the guerrillas wanted to also have women in the police force. Now, I was surrounded by all of these men, and I don't think they had an open ear for that. And I insisted that we actually had women in the police force, in the civil police force, because it was important, because it should be representative of the population and not only men. And that was done. And I think, I had great part in pushing for that. And that's what I find fascinating, where you can really make a change. But I was the first woman at the D2 level, which was, was responsible in the Political Affairs Department. I was also the first Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, and that was basically covering a huge area. It was, in essence, everything except the south of the Sahara, the whole world. And I remember that I had people sort of saying to me, well, how could you possibly do that as a woman? Thinking about prejudices against women, maybe in the Middle East, maybe in other countries, how could you do that? And I said to them, look, no one can take that function away from you. If you allow people to walk all over you and say, go to your boss or something, who's my boss? It's an Undersecretary General. It's very, very hard. You just have to do it professionally and not be sidelined by maybe some snide comments or some remarks that are being made or things that you're imagining, could be a slight against you. I think that's really, really, really important. And it's really been proven because when I was responsible for the investigation in Syria, I dealt with the Syrians. And again, the only woman in the conference room for the negotiations was the secretary who was taking notes, and myself. And so you have to just not be intimidated by that, but just to say, I'm here to do a job. I have the authority to do the job, and I'm going to damn well do that job.
Perfect. But let me stop before we go to Syria, because I also had a question about that to you. I also want to stop on El Salvador and maybe ask you, so you already mentioned that guerrillas wanted to have women as a part of the civilian force, which was a police force, which was... how did others in the room of the negotiators, how did they look at that? Were you the only one who actually advocated for that? Was it already back then an issue that women should be more involved in all sorts of peace negotiations and arrangements? Because as we know, the more women are involved, the longer the peace agreements actually last. So would you say that this particular specific point somehow improved the success of El Salvador peace accords? Even with all the faults, still it basically holds until today.
I don't want to take the entire credit for doing this. First of all, it was a demand by the guerrillas, and it was a very good demand because they sort of said, we have been fighting together with women. They need a recognition, and they also need a job because they're coming back into civil life. And so they were very insistent on that. And I totally agreed with that. And it was just a matter to sort of see how can we make it happen. The team that I had put together, which was basically police experts from various countries, when you talk about a position and you hold it in a very passionate stance and you argue for it, it'll be harder to push up against it. And I don't think that the people are really pushing up against it. I mean, we had a Swede who was on the commission, we had a Spaniard, we had a Venezuelan, and we had a Canadian. They were coming from, I would say, countries where also there were women in police forces, etc. So, they were in favor of it. What we did have to push against very, very strongly was the government, because the government only had a military police, and there were basically 4 different police services, but they were all interchangeable with the military. So they were not happy with that at all. And they had all kinds of difficulties and, like this and that and the other. But sometimes you just have to make the point, and you have to just say, this is not negotiable. This is what we want, and this is what's going to be in the peace agreement. They had to agree to it because it was a negotiation. But on the other hand, they in the end, they did agree to it. But where they quibbled, and that's again where you can see, how do you kind of weaken arguments that are being made. What they said, for example, because many of the guerrillas, including the women particularly, they didn't have enough years of schooling. And to enter the police force, you had to have a minimum school year, I think it was 8 years or something, I don't recall, 8 or 9 years. And these women did not have the requisite years of schooling. And so they said, well, they can't enter because they don't have the requisite years of schooling. So then you have to, again, think about how can you solve that issue? How can you actually make sure that you are circumventing that obstacle, which is going to be put there because they don't want the women in the peace force? And again, we compromised. And again, women were admitted to the police force. But that's when the peace agreement was signed. Here we are, years later, and the current president, Nayib Bukele, basically has denigrated the peace accords. He has changed a great deal. He has total control of the legislature. So in essence, he can subvert it years later. But at the time, it was a tremendous achievement. And everyone expected that, now we have a peace agreement and that's going to be implemented. And we're going to be kind of, I don't want to say happily ever after, but, that was also not true because it was very, very difficult to make sure that these peace agreements were properly implemented. But I wanted to say that right now, and MARYLIA, you're right, it's very difficult because if women are part of the peace processes, they have a much better chance of sticking. And I just looked it up, but in 2021, women represented less than one quarter of the delegates in peace processes that are led or co-led by the UN. I don't know about all of the peace process, but that's basically by the UN or co-led by the UN. If you think about the recent negotiations with the Taliban, there was one woman at the table. So it's really not enough, because when you also look at in peace operations, which is not only peacekeeping, but generally peace operations, women made up only 5.2% if there was any military component. 5.2%. Let me turn on some lights because it's getting... So I'm back.
Perfect. Yes, then if you mention peace operations, maybe my next question would be about your assignment to the United Nations mission to Eritrea and Ethiopia, where the mandate of the mission was basically to monitor the ceasefire, and the mission was dissolved later on when Eritrea basically restricted the delivery of fuel, and it was all basically... It was stopped. The mission was stopped because of a member state who pushed against it. So my question here, even though you weren't there until the very end of the mission, my question would be to you: how did you basically perceive this balance between what the UN can do and what the local governments are doing? Like how much room for maneuver did you have, and also how did you perceive how it was affecting the civilian population? Your role there, how much could you actually contribute apart from the main mandate, if it was possible to do anything else?
Well, that's it's very interesting because the mission was really there to supervise the demarcation of the border. I mean, that was the primary purpose. And this was based on an agreement that had been made, a binding agreement that had been made by Ethiopia and Eritrea. They both selected two persons each, two experts, and they jointly chose one head of this boundary commission that was going to tell them exactly where the boundary was going to run. And so in the end, Ethiopia refused to implement that boundary commission decision. They had all kinds of difficulties. They said, well, they never came here. And the border is over 1,000 kilometers long. So it's a long, long border. And there was one particular area which was in the most fertile part of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And there was one village at the time. I mean, I visited it, and there wasn't even a paved road in that village. I mean, it was nothing. But on the other hand, it was for them, for both sides, very emotional. And Eritrea insisted this is the boundary that was drawn. It was a binding arbitration by that boundary commission, and Ethiopia has to implement that. I totally agree with that, because basically that was the law, that was the agreement that they made, a binding arbitration, binding accept, and Ethiopia just stepped back from it. And then the issue is like, what can actually the UN do? And I give you an example. I mean, what I found extremely painful was that Ethiopia was to 80% of the government expenses were covered by member states. UK, US, a few other states, but UK and US were the most, let's say, generous ones in propping up the state. And we talked, I mean, I was the Deputy Secretary General. I had a boss who was Botswanan, and he was the Secretary General. He traveled to various capitals. I talked to people whenever I could. In Ethiopia, you had various dignitaries, various, people who were visited from the National Security Council, Foreign Minister of the UK, etc. And basically what they told me, and I said, you can force Ethiopia to accept that because you are basically funding the Ethiopian government. So you have to find a way to put pressure on them to agree to this agreement. And they basically said, no, Ethiopia is too important. We can't do that. And we have to prop up Ethiopia because basically it's a pillar of stability in North Africa. And so therefore we cannot let it happen. I found that extremely, extremely disappointing. And I found it very difficult to accept that. And Ethiopia just basically, they waited for the big week in September when the General Assembly meets, when everyone was preoccupied. That's basically when they put down the hatchet and sort of said, no, we're not going to implement it. Ditto, full stop, that's it. And in the end, that led to Eritrea walking away from the peace agreement and basically sort of saying that, look, the UN is useless. They cannot implement the agreement. That's what they are here for. So the purpose of their presence basically, is no longer valid. So that was very, very difficult. But I tell you, the other difficulty that you have if you are a woman in a peacekeeping session, you come there, and it had 4,200 troops. It had like 600 civilians, so it was close to 5,000 people. And my boss, who I said, he was traveling a lot. He was kind of doing the public diplomacy, with member states, etc. So I basically ran the mission. And that's why I was appointed, because when I was appointed, I was told by the Secretary General, I want you to run the mission because, the ambassador who was appointed as SRSG, Special Representative of the Secretary General, he's an outsider. So he doesn't know the UN, he does not. And then you have to deal with this. First of all, I've never served in the army. I mean, what is a colonel? What's a major? What's a brigadier general? How does that all relate? I had to learn all of this. This is like where, as a woman, you basically have to do your homework. But on the other hand, you also have to do you have to give them medals. They get medals after they've been on the mission assignment for 6 weeks. You go and visit the peacekeeping troops, and there's a certain decorum, and there's a certain process that you have to have. You learn that. And I give you another example. I always love to visit the Indian peacekeepers because they had the best food. And, and Eritrea at the time just didn't have a lot of, good food available, because it was a very poor country. So I would go there, and then they would kind of have these groups, and they would have a problem because I was a woman, but normally the women and the men, if there was, let's say, a dinner or something, they would segregate. So they would sit the women with the women, and the men would sit with the men. And they told me this afterwards. They had a great problem. Where did they sit me? And then they decided that since I was a person of rank, I had to sit with the men. And I give you another example. We had Kenyan peacekeepers, and when I visited the Kenyan peacekeepers, there was a woman, and it was in the eastern part of Eritrea, which is very dusty. It's very dirty. I mean, because there's no rain or anything, so it's very. So there was a woman, and she was holding a metal bowl and had a little white towel over her hand for me to wash my hands, which was very thoughtful. And so I talked to her, and I said, I'm glad to see that, you're a woman, you're here, and what's your rank? And she said, I can't remember exactly, but I think she was a major. And I said, you were a major, and you're offering me water and a towel? I said, that should be done by an orderly and not by me. So I called basically the general who was commanding those troops, and I told him that was totally unacceptable, that this woman, and he said, well, but she's a woman and you're a woman, and so maybe, but you have to make it clear that is not acceptable. You just have to be sure that this is the position that you're taking, and it never happened again.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you very much for this answer. Let me maybe ask you about another assignment of yours. When you served as the UN High Representative for Disarmament, you launched this the investigation into the chemical weapons attack in Syria in 2013, and that eventually also contributed to the dismantlement of the chemical weapons stockpile in the country. And I imagine that it was also very difficult to convince some member states, the UN members, to organize such an investigation. And so the question is twofold. Basically, the first is how did you overcome maybe this resistance, or after the report was issued, was there any objections to it? And the second part is your thoughts in this process on leadership. Where do you, how do you push for such things without, making damage? So there is a balance between both.
Marylia, there was really no opposition to my taking over this investigation. And I think part of that was because I was by then a fairly known quantity in the UN, and people knew me. And it makes a difference if you know people or they know you, they know what to expect. And I have basically always been fairly straightforward. And in fact, I had quite a large number of people from the UN civil service, the international civil service, who came to me and they said they were absolutely amazed that I made it as high as I did because I was so outspoken. But I believe there's a certain integrity that you have to have, and there's a certain ethical sense of what you really want to achieve. So I did not have opposition, but I did have opposition in terms of not to my person, but to basically what I wanted to achieve. And again, a negotiation is always a give and take. But I was bound by a certain document that was the Secretary General's mechanism. I was bound by certain requirements, like to have an understanding with the government as to what was their responsibility, what was my responsibility, or what was the team's responsibility. And that isn't always easy. You know, in a negotiation, you never have a winner and a loser. You always have to make sure that you have to be give a little bit of a flexibility so the other side doesn't feel like they are conquered or they are vanquished. But you have to basically see, you know, where do you want to end up in? You have to know what you need to have. And at one time, you know, you have to also sort of say, I remember there was this back and forth about these obligations and, you know, what we could take into the country, etc., which took far too long. And then, you know, all of a sudden we wouldn't get the documents in English, but we'd get them in Arabic. And then, you know, we'd have to translate them. I don't speak Arabic. We'd have to translate them. The team didn't speak Arabic. And I sort of said to the ambassador, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. We need to have it in English. And I said, you know, I mean, basically, you cannot work that way. And you know, you have to be a little blustery and sort of say, this is something that you actually need to take into account because you want that team there and we want to go there, but you also have to help us make it possible. And in the end, you know, that basically happened. And I give you another example. So I go to Syria and I'm in Damascus and I'm negotiating with them. And they were very tough negotiations. I knew what I wanted. They didn't want what I wanted. So clearly we wanted to, you know, end up in different places. But I knew some of the people. I mean, I knew two of the people, the men in the negotiation team, because I had interacted with them before. And I find that it really helps if you have already established a bit of a rapport with them, because they know who you are, they know where they can and they cannot push you. And they also know that you're going to basically make sure that what you promise is going to come through. And I give you an example of that, because in the end, when we finished the investigation, the Syrians were unhappy that we hadn't investigated the original request of Khan al-Assal, which they had wanted, because we had investigated primarily the chemical attack in Ghouta. And they basically wanted us to stay in the country and finish everything and then hand in the report. And I told them very, you know, clearly, no, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be possible. I'm going to pull the team out. I'm going to send them back as soon as I can. And I can promise you that. But I said they're exhausted and we need to have the results of the Ghouta investigation. And they had to accept that. But on the other hand, less than 3 weeks later, the team was back in Damascus to finish the work. And that is something where you basically build up confidence that whatever you say is something that you're actually going to do. And it doesn't make a difference whether it's a man or a woman or whatever. But that's really important when you have a negotiation, that you sort of say, I'm going to do that and I'm going to follow up on that. I promise you that. And then you do. So that's something that I find extremely, extremely important, that you have a credibility that you're building up. And that is something that you really need to do. So, you know, but again, in that particular instance, I had one woman legal advisor who had traveled with me on one time. Everyone else was a man. Because also, you know, the team it was a dangerous mission. And, you know, they were experts who were coming with me. But the one aspect that I'm still very, very proud of, and you asked about that, is this is the only report that was accepted by Syria, by Russia, without any complaints at all. When it was completed and it was handed over to the Secretary General Security Council, and I remember the Russian representative came to me and he sort of said, you know, look, we want to send this to Moscow. We want to make sure that, you know, this is all as we think it should be. And I said, yes, please. They came back and they gave me a huge document, you know, where they had some comments on it. And I turned over to the team leader, who was a Swede, Arke Sellström, and I sort of said, look, Arke, I'm not a scientist. You need to look at that. And he did. And he said, you know, really, he said, it's nothing. And I said, it doesn't matter that you consider it's nothing. I want you to go to Moscow and discuss with the scientists in Moscow whatever they have raised. And he did. And that's the only report where you've never heard anything about the possibility that it couldn't be fair, it couldn't be correct or whatever. And that was a report where sarin was definitely found.
Perfect. So that's a lesson learned for me. So it matters always to speak to others, even if you think that it's less important than it is to them. Yeah. Nice. Let me ask you, maybe in connection to that also, and before I ask this question, I also want to remind the audience that if they have some questions, they can post them in the Q&A session box here on Zoom. And if you're watching us on Facebook, you can also ask the questions in the comment section there. But yeah, my next question would be also about reporting on these high-level discussions and negotiations. I mean, in the media, in the mainstream media. Would you say, how do you perceive it in general? Is it, in your experience, specifically in Syria or in general, is the reporting adequate? Does it always reflect on how the process looks to you, for example, or is it somehow misrepresented, oftentimes maybe unintentionally? But how are the media able to capture the picture as it maybe feels like when you're sitting in the room?
No, and never. Very rare. And unless you give them all of the background information, and frankly, it's not always a good idea to basically give all of this information to the press, because that's another thing that you learn when you are in sensitive processes, and particularly in political processes. You don't go around broadcasting you've talked to X or you've talked to Y, and that's what you've learned. I mean, the best idea is really to be discreet. And that's one lesson that I learned very early on. As you kind of climb up the ladder, you also get invited to maybe a National Day reception, or maybe you get invited to a lunch, or maybe you get invited to a dinner. Take advantage of that. Go. Because what happens at these events is you're not only standing there with a glass of wine or juice or whatever it is that you drink and have a nice time and do some chit-chat. No, you do business. Because there will be someone who will ask you a question, and rather than picking up the phone or making an appointment in the office, it's much easier to approach someone at a social level and just basically try to find out, where are the touch points, what is it you want to know? And that is extremely important. And you build up a network that is extremely useful and that you profit from. And sometimes network is seen as something that is not very good. It's like you take advantage of something. It's not. You're making yourself available, and you are basically also seeing that others are available who you want to interact with, who you want to ask questions with, who you interact professionally with, except the interaction is not in a meeting or it's not in an office, but it's at a social occasion. So I think that there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think it's silly if people don't take advantage of that. And sometimes it is, I think it's true that, maybe women sort of say, well, I have to pick up my child at the daycare or something like that. So it's not always possible. But other times it's also at lunchtime. It doesn't always have to be in the evening. Or maybe you just go, for 15 minutes because all of these things are usually in the vicinity. So that's something that is very, very important. But, the media, no. If you think about how the media very often represents women, and I was thinking about that because you had recently last year, you had several of the ambassadors who were appointed by the new President Biden when he came into office. And, there were hearings about it. So then, these people were described. And I'm giving you two examples. There were 4 ambassadors who were appointed. And when I looked at the way that they were described, the 2 ambassadors, one of whom actually is in Vienna here, one of the ambassadors was the 2 women who were described as to their background, very impressive candidates, very impressive women ambassadors. They were talking in the articles about their husbands, what the husbands had done. Excuse me, these women are going to be ambassadors. It's not about spouse, it's about them. And I was just outraged when I read that. The men, by contrast, no, there was nothing about that. And that, I think, is very much a tilt in the media portrayal that is unfortunately still persisting. And the other thing is there was, I think it was Julia Bird, who was the former Prime Minister of Australia. And she was also published in a book, and there was like 8 stories or something. And the outcome of this was like, if you are a woman and you want to go into politics, be prepared to be criticized for your dress and your, attitude. I mean, think about how Hillary Clinton was really hounded by the press. She stumbled, she looked pale, that color didn't look good on her or something like that. And also be prepared to be judged on your procreative choices. Do you have children? Do you not have children, etc. I mean, it was just like mind-opening. This is not 20 years ago. This was last year that this book was published. And I think that is still the case.
Oh, well, very enlightening, if not encouraging answer in some sense. But let me ask you a question that was posed in the audience. So from your experience, can you derive recommendations for the present Ukraine-Russia talks, going back to your discussion of negotiations?
Well, I think that what we have seen, not only in the Ukraine, but what we've also seen in Afghanistan, that women very often, are the ones bearing the brunt of what happens in a country. And I think that is very much true when we see that. I mentioned already in the Taliban negotiations, there was one woman. All I can say is that, as we say, and as you had mentioned, peace processes are much more stable when women are involved, because they have, I think, a different view, a longer-term view of these proceedings. And on the other hand, when you look at the women who are now basically leaving the Ukraine, very often with children as well, how can they, what can be done to help them? And I think we have to be very, very clear in distinguishing, because you have women as agents, as political agents, and then you have women as victims. And unfortunately, in the Ukrainian situation, we see the women as victims primarily. That is very, very sad. And when I look back at the United Nations, they had this landmark resolution that was adopted 21 years ago, Resolution 1325, and it had 3 aims. And one of the aims was, of course, women as political agents, and the other one was women in development, and the third one was basically helping women who are in difficult situations, like in war, like in conflicts, because they are the ones who are suffering. We've seen that all over the world. What I like, and when you look at it and you sort of say, what can you do about it? And that's a very good question. Is, Margot Wallström, when she was the foreign minister of Sweden, was the first woman foreign minister who sort of said, we are going to have a feminist foreign policy. What does that mean? Everyone was sort of saying, what does that mean? And what she was saying is, it's not only having women in the government, and, I think the Nordic countries in particular have made tremendous progress because of quotas. They've set quotas, very important. But she also sort of said that our foreign policy and our development policy must be directed towards helping women, not only helping them as victims, but also enabling them to have a job or to further their education. Our foreign policy aspect, our foreign policy purpose is to help women. And that was something that I find very important. And what I think it's really important when I look at the European Union, we always sort of say, we are kind of a little bit, of norms, human rights, gender equality. But if you look at it, it's really not quite as good. And I found a report in October 2020. Now, again, it's a year and a half ago, but still, there was a report that was pushing gender equality in the EU foreign policy. And that was approved. Now, listen to this. 477 member of parliaments, European parliaments in favor, 112 against, and 94 absentees. And usually people are absentees if they really don't want to vote on something. But that means that basically you had 477 versus 220. I mean, that I find really a sad amount. And they called for a minimum of 50% women in decision-making positions and 85% of EU development assistance to be set aside specifically for gender equality programs. I find that really, really amazing. And when you look at Austria, I think it was today in the paper or something, that Austria still has a pay gap between women and men of close to 19%. And that's the third ultimate last, in the all of the EU. That's not a good statistic. And there are other countries that now have a feminist foreign policy. I think it's Mexico, it's Canada, and Belgium, I think. I'm not quite sure, but there are a couple of other ones, and some of them are in the process of developing it.
Yeah, thank you. I will pose another question, which was actually asked by 2 people even. How do you see the future of disarmament in the face of resurgent conflicts, and in particular the current conflict war in Europe, in Ukraine? Yeah, and the EU, another question also added to it that there is a rearmament in Europe, and there is a discussion about the rearmament. How does it play into the disarmament efforts?
Well, the disarmament effort is in dire straits, to be honest with you. And it isn't only in dire straits because of the production of weapons, that are non-nuclear, that are conventional weapons. But on the other hand, when you're looking at what is happening with the threat by President Putin to basically put nuclear weapons on alert. Now, mind you, they're already on alert. They don't have to be put extra on alert, except maybe he's adding some on alert. And this comes 6 weeks after the P5, the nuclear weapons who are in the Non-Proliferation Treaty have basically affirmed the Reagan-Gorbachev statement of 1987, saying nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. 6 weeks ago, they agreed to this. And so I find this absolutely unacceptable. And on the other hand, what are we going to do about it? I think that this is really the most incredibly dangerous tipping point that we have reached in the situation in the Ukraine, with the Russian war against Ukraine, also with pulling in Belarus into this situation. And you have now, I think it's about 1.5 million people who have fled the Ukraine, mostly, as you know, because the men are not allowed between 18 and 60 to leave the Ukraine, but mostly women and children who have fled the Ukraine. And on the other hand, the threat of nuclear war. And think also of the fact that there was a nuclear energy power plant that was damaged. And yes, it was contained, but who gives us the guarantee that there are not other accidents? There are 4 nuclear power plants in the Ukraine, 4 of them. And if there is a target that basically is targeted, or rather, if there's a power plant that is targeted, this could be a catastrophe on the scale of, let's say, Chernobyl or Fukushima or whatever it is. This is not a possibility that you can discard. And that I find extremely, extremely dangerous, because we are now in a spiral that the question is, how can you bring it back? How can you actually de-escalate the tension? And that is something that I find very, very hard, because we're now not only talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine, Belarus being pulled into it, but we're also talking about the JCPOA, which actually looked like it could find a solution. I mean, there was very hard work that was done for it. I think it was very good work, and I was very encouraged. And now there are additional demands that are being made by President Putin, that unless those are fulfilled, he will not join the JCPOA agreement. And that brings it again to a tipping point that one says, is it possible to actually get an agreement on the JCPOA, which I think is absolutely critical.
Absolutely. So maybe one more question about, because you named a lot of things that create this uncertainty in relations between states, for people, for individuals. So my question to you, how do you handle uncertainty when you negotiate, when you go to the discussions where the stakes are really high? How do you, maybe some personal do's and don'ts?
Marylia, what you do is you close your mind to it. If you start thinking about, I have been in a lot of dangerous situations. I mean, when I was in the Congo, I had 2 bodyguards with me all the time. I was in Haiti for quite some time. I had bodyguards. And basically, you're a target, you can be attacked, and that creates tremendous pressure on you. But if you cannot set that aside, if you focus on the danger, if you focus on the danger that you're in, if you focus on your person and the vulnerability of the situation in which you are, you can't negotiate, because it just subsumes your whole thinking. And I basically am very good at, and maybe it's also because I've lived in countries, like countries, you're like Buddhist philosophy, if you so want. And I basically accept what is my lot. And that means that if I am falling victim to an attack, that's the way it is. I probably won't be able to prevent it anyway. I'm not careless. I am also quite careful. But on the other hand, I kind of put that aside. I put blinkers on and I focus on the task at hand. And that's the only thing I can do. And the same was true, for example, in Syria. The same was true when I was in the Congo. The same was true when I was in Haiti. The same was true, if you so want, in El Salvador, because to meet the guerrillas in El Salvador, you were basically threatened by an attack by the government. I mean, they weren't quite sure they really wanted us to do the work, but they wanted to hit at the guerrillas. And it would have been a tremendously explosive event if they'd actually hit us. So you have to set that aside. You can't be subsumed by fear, because then you can't do good work. And if you can't do that, then maybe you shouldn't be in that business.
So let me ask you another question from the audience about the feminist foreign policy. And it goes as follows. Is foreign policy automatically feminist if the foreign policy resort is headed by a woman, or does it not require far-reaching changes in the political landscape of a state?
No, it does require changes. And actually, I think I remember it now, it's France and Spain. They also have feminist foreign policy. But, just because a woman is head of a foreign ministry, it doesn't mean at all it's a feminist foreign policy, because it's not a person's foreign policy, but it's a government's foreign policy. So you need to have, the government pull, into this whole possibility of focusing on gender in the issue. And as I said, much of it is like, what can we do to basically have gender equality? What can we do to bring more women into the decision-making powers? But how can we also, if we have foreign aid, for example, make sure that this foreign aid is used in such a way that women are empowered, not basically to give them to survive for another month or another year, but basically to empower them. And when I was living in Indonesia, I was actually in the development field. And what was happening is that Indonesia at that time had a very high birth rate, and they wanted to bring it down. And so when they brought it down as an incentive, they wanted women to have an implant to have birth control. And as a reward, they would be given money. And this money, there was a training program to say, we give you this money, but you have to earn more money with this money. You have to start like a little business. And so they did. They made tempe, or they made little children's clothing, or they did something or the other. And then we would visit these places, and we would visit the women, and we would follow up on this and so say, well, what's happened? Well, what happened was the men took all the money, and then they went and they drank it all, or, whatever. So basically the women were complaining to us, and they said, yes, you give us the money, and then we're trying to start something, but then, our men take it all away from us. And that is something that, how do you handle that? You can, it's very hard, because in a society where the man is the all-powerful decision maker, he's the head of the household, etc. So it's really hard to instill a certain power of agency, to instill the agency in women that they can say something. And so we tried to see if we could have like a women's cooperative or something. It's hard work, and you have to start at the small scale. But on the other hand, it's exhilarating. It's wonderful if it works. And that, I think, really is the reward that you get when you work on these issues.
Thank you very much, Angela. Our time is running up, so let me maybe ask you one last question. And so if you look at the decades of your work at the United Nations, what would you say was the most interesting period for you in all these years, and why was it so interesting for you, if you had to choose?
I would basically say that the most interesting period was really the whole political part, in which I, the political assignments that I had. That was from the El Salvador to even the mission in the Congo, the Eritrea. I loved living abroad. I also loved my assignment in Indonesia, for example. You immerse yourself in a very different way if you live in a country rather than if you're visiting it, even if you're visiting it for a month or two. And it was really what I loved about it also is my colleagues at the UN, and that is, we had a good team. You don't really put your team together. The El Salvador experience was different because it was an ad hoc arrangement, but normally you go to a department, or you take over a unit, or you take over, a whole office, and then you inherit the team, and then you sort of say, okay, well, how do we sit together, and how do we actually handle all of these issues that we have to complete, and how do we have to act together? And that is something that also takes hard work, in terms of that you have to prove yourself that you can actually lead the team, and that you want the team to do well, not only yourself. You don't take all the credit. You're basically presenting the work of the team. You're just the team leader. But on the other hand, I think it's very, very hard, and that's something that you work on as well. But I have basically, you work with interesting people, and that makes the work interesting. And I always thought it was wonderful. You get up in the morning and you enjoy going to work. You like going to work. You like meeting with people. That's the thing that I've missed most in COVID, that it's all virtual. I like to sort of sit there and talk, or, meet someone, have a cup of coffee, or, have a little chat or something like that. And then, how is it going? And you're much better plugged in as well. That is all lost to us right now during COVID. And I'm hoping that now we're getting back into a more normal in a normal environment. Hopefully the COVID will further decline. And that's basically my wish, that we can all meet without any restrictions and actually start being in the office again, have that cup of coffee, have that glass of wine, go to reception. So that's basically my hope for this coming year and next. And no more war, no more conflict. I know that that is a very hard wish to fulfill, but on the other hand, we have to believe that there are better times ahead.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. And I would just make, name some takeaways for women in the field. So you mentioned role models are important for women training, and group discussions are important to support each other. Quotas also work, and feminist foreign policy also matters. Depends how you implement it, but it is important if you do it in goodwill. And for maybe young career professionals, it's useful to look for interesting jobs and not necessarily promotions, not only promotions. And establishing connections and networking is also part of the deal. And for the conflict resolution, if I can sum up in one sentence, is that we need to leave our fears behind and act upon things and try to do our best. And with this, I would like to conclude this discussion and wish you all a good evening. And thank you again so much.
Thank you very much, Marylia. Thank you for your excellent moderation. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.